The chamber was still, yet the silence carried a weight heavier than any gavel. Eyes fixed forward. Cameras locked in place, every lens thirsty for the spark of controversy. And then it came. Clarence Thomas, stoic and immovable, leaned forward. With the calculated poise of someone who had worn the robe of power for decades, his words cut through the air like cold steel. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are disrespecting tradition." The line wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was delivered with the heavy arrogance of history. The certainty that tradition itself was an unchallengeable weapon. To his allies, it was a reprimand, a reminder of hierarchy. To others, it was an accusation meant to shrink, to silence. To remind Jasmine Crockett of her place in a room built long before she ever stepped foot in it. The cameras caught her face in that instant. Not rage, not fear, something else. A fire barely concealed behind a composed exterior. The murmur of the chamber began to rise, low voices trading nervous speculation. Reporters' fingers hammering keyboards, social media already lighting up. Disrespecting tradition was a phrase designed to sting, a phrase that had been used for generations to hold the line against change. But Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary lawmaker. She was not bred from the marble floors and velvet curtains of Washington's establishment. She carried the cadence of community, the sharp wit of survival, and the unapologetic pride of someone who knew the weight of her own voice. And at that moment, millions could sense she was deciding whether to let the accusation stand or to turn it into something far larger. Because this wasn't just about decorum. It wasn't just about tradition. It was about power, about who got to define respect, about who belonged in the narrative of America and who was forever cast as an outsider. Clarence Thomas had chosen his battleground, but Jasmine Crockett had brought a weapon of her own, truth spoken without fear, and as the chamber waited, the air tightened, breaths held in suspense. Every second felt like a coiled spring, the nation. Perched on the edge of the next word, what came after would not simply be a rebuttal, it would be a moment that ricocheted far beyond those four walls. But nobody in that chamber was ready for how Jasmine Crockett would respond. To understand the weight of Clarence Thomas's words, you have to zoom out beyond that single chamber, beyond the marble walls and the chandeliers that have witnessed centuries of power plays. His accusation, disrespecting tradition, wasn't just aimed at Jasmine Crockett. It was aimed at an entire generation that dared to challenge the comfortable order, a challenge that threatened to upend what had long been considered untouchable. For decades, tradition has been wielded like a shield. It has been the phrase invoked to silence dissent, to police behavior, to preserve the comfort of those who benefit most from the status quo. It was the rallying cry against civil rights. It was the justification for exclusion. And now it was being hurled once more, this time at a young, outspoken black congresswoman, whose very presence in that room was itself a disruption of old norms. But Crockett represented more than herself. She was the embodiment of a new wave of leaders, progressive and apologetic, unafraid to call out hypocrisy no matter how gilded the source. They weren't raised to bow before the word tradition. They were raised to ask whose tradition, and at whose expense. Across the country, these lines were being drawn everywhere between generations, between races, between visions of America's future. The old guard clung to rituals, ceremony, and hierarchy, insisting that the fabric of the nation would unravel without them. Yet 2 million watching, tradition felt less like fabric and more like chains, keeping communities bound to rules written in eras where they had no voice. That's why this moment mattered. Because Clarence Thomas wasn't just one man invoking the past. He was standing as the symbol of an establishment that believed authority itself was respect. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just one woman preparing to respond. She was carrying the voices of those who knew respect had to be earned, not demanded, as the tension thickened. Television commentators scrambled to contextualize the exchange. Some framed it as generational, a justice nearing the twilight of his career, facing off against a congresswoman who spoke for an America that looked younger, more diverse, less willing to accept silence. Others saw it as ideological, conservatism cloaked in heritage against progressivism armed with lived experience. and beneath it all lay the deeper, unspoken truth. Race, identity, and belonging had always been the undercurrent of what was deemed tradition. Viewers watching from living rooms, classrooms, and crowded buses leaned in, knowing instinctively that this wasn't just a clash of words, it was a clash of worlds. It was the sound of the old order reminding everyone of its rules, and it was the sight of a new order preparing to break them. The chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation, every second daring Crockett to stay silent, to retreat. But silence was not why she was sent there. She was sent to that room precisely to do the opposite, to challenge, to confront, to speak for the millions who had been told their voices disrupted the sanctity of American tradition. And as her eyes fixed on Thomas, the confrontation became more than a quarrel between two figures. It became a mirror held up to the nation itself, reflecting back a question that could no longer be ignored. Whose America are we living in? The America of inherited authority, or the America of earned respect? The answer wasn't going to come quietly. It was about to come in the form of words that would echo far beyond the chamber, igniting debates, hashtags, and headlines. Because what happened next wouldn't just be about one exchange. It would become a national flashpoint to understand why Clarence Thomas's words carried such weight. You have to trace the long, winding path of his rise to power, a path steeped in contradiction, cloaked in tradition, and defended with a sternness that has come to define his legacy. Thomas came from humble beginnings. Born in Pinpoint, Georgia, a community forged out of resilience by freed slaves, his story could have been one of unshakable empathy, of carrying the struggle of his people into the halls of justice. And for a brief moment that seemed possible. But over time, his journey bent toward a different arc, toward conservatism, so rigid it often seemed to erase the very struggles that had birthed him. When he was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1991, the nation erupted in debate. The hearings were brutal, dominated by Anita Hill's testimony of sexual harassment, a controversy that clings to his name even today. For his supporters, surviving those hearings became a badge of honor, proof that he was a man persecuted by politics. For his critics, it was evidence that the system had once again protected power at the expense of truth. Either way, from the moment Thomas ascended to the bench, he embraced the role of guardian not of progress, but of the past. His judicial philosophy was simple in its rigidity. The Constitution must be interpreted as it was understood at the time it was written. That meant tradition wasn't just respected, it was calcified. It was a worldview that framed change as dangerous and precedent as sacred. Again and again, Thomas positioned himself as the defender of an imagined past. One where order was clear, hierarchies were fixed, and challenges to authority were met with stern dismissal. But the irony was impossible to ignore. A black man from the South, raised in poverty, sitting on the nation's highest court yet too often. His rulings seemed to pull the ladder up behind him. Affirmative action? Struck down. Expansions of voting rights? Curtailed. Protections for marginalized groups narrowed. His defenders called it principled. His critics called it betrayal. Either way, Clarence Thomas wielded tradition not as a memory of culture but as a weapon of control. And it wasn't only in law where contradictions emerged. Outside the courtroom, questions swirled around ethics. Lavish gifts, undisclosed. Trips, financial ties that blurred the lines between impartiality and influence. To his critics, these revelations painted a picture of a man who spoke of principle but enjoyed the privileges of unchecked power. To his supporters, they were distractions, irrelevant to his decades-long service. Yet even those who disagreed with him had to admit, Thomas knew how to wield silence. Rarely speaking during oral arguments, he let his written opinions carry the force of his ideology. Every word on the page dripped with a disdain for change, a reverence for the old ways, and a warning to anyone who thought tradition could be so easily discarded. That's why, when he leaned forward in that chamber and accused Jasmine Crockett of disrespecting tradition, it wasn't a casual remark. It was the distilled essence of his entire career. It was the echo of a man who had spent decades enforcing the old order, who saw every challenge not as debate, but as defiance. He was not simply defending tradition. He was defending the very system that had elevated him, contradictions and all, and yet, beneath the marble-hard exterior, there was something else. Fear. Not of Crockett personally, but of what she represented. Leaders like her weren't intimidated by appeals to history. They didn't tremble when told they were out of line. They understood that tradition, when unchallenged, becomes a cage. Thomas, perhaps more than anyone, knew what happens when a cage is rattled loudly enough, the whole structure shakes. For years, he had been untouchable, cloaked in the prestige of the bench, insulated by allies who celebrated his unbending stance. He had outlasted critics, weathered scandals, and continued to impose his vision of order. But here, in this clash, he was not the silent justice issuing opinions from on high. He was face to face with a voice that refused to shrink. The irony of Clarence Thomas's story is that it embodies both the triumph of breaking barriers and the tragedy of defending them once broken. He became the enforcer of the very boundaries that once constrained him, proof that power can reshape even the most unlikely outsiders into guardians of the status quo. And so, as his accusation hung in the air, it wasn't just the voice of Clarence Thomas speaking. It was the echo of decades of entrenched authority, of doors that creaked open only to be slammed shut for others. He had been the enforcer of the old order, but today, that order was about to be challenged. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in marble halls or ivy-covered institutions. It began in the grit of everyday America, where communities are stitched together, not by wealth or tradition, but by resilience and the refusal to stay silent. Long before she locked eyes with Clarence Thomas, Crockett had already lived the kind of journey that forged steel out of fire. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, she grew up in a family that understood struggle intimately. Her parents were not figures of privilege but models of persistence, people who taught her that dignity was not granted by titles or institutions. It was carried in how you stood, even when the world tried to knock you down. In their home, faith, perseverance, and community were not abstract ideals. They were survival tools. She carried those lessons with her to college, where she pursued a path in law. It wasn't an easy climb. It's a young black woman stepping into spaces still dominated by white men. Crockett faced the constant undertow of doubt, condescension, and outright dismissal. But every skeptical glance, every whispered doubt only sharpened her resolve. She didn't just want a degree. She wanted the power to defend those whose voices the system tried to silence. That's why, when she became an attorney, she didn't seek the cushy law firms or corporate contracts that promised comfort. She went straight into civil rights and criminal defense, representing people the system preferred to forget. She defended the poor, the marginalized, the accused. In cramped courtrooms and overstuffed dockets, she learned the rhythm of injustice. Way tradition was invoked not to serve justice, but to preserve control. She saw judges who dismissed defendants with contempt, prosecutors who stretched the truth for easy convictions, and communities that never seemed to get their day in court. It was in those trenches that Jasmine Crockett discovered her voice. A voice that was sharp, relentless, unwilling to bend. A voice that carried the sting of truth and the weight of lived experience. And when she turned that voice toward politics, she did so not to join the club, but to disrupt it. Her rise to Congress was never guaranteed. She faced skepticism, even from her own side. Too outspoken, too unapologetic, too unwilling to play the game. But she leaned into those criticisms and made them her strength. Why should she be apologetic when the people she represented had been denied apologies for generations? Why should she soften her words when the injustice she fought against was anything but soft? In Washington, her presence was electric. She walked into hearings not as a guest in someone else's house, but as a rightful tenant of the people's chamber. She questioned with precision, rebutted with fury, and called out hypocrisy, even when it made colleagues shift uncomfortably in their seats. And yet, beneath the fire, there was something grounding in authenticity that made her relatable, human. She wasn't posturing for cameras. She was channeling every person who had ever been told to lower their voice, to wait their turn, to respect a tradition that had never respected them. That's what made her clash with Clarence Thomas so symbolic. Because in that room, she wasn't just Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman from Texas. She was the living embodiment of progress. The daughter of ordinary parents, standing toe-to-toe with the guardian of entrenched authority, was the reminder that America was changing. That change was not waiting for permission. Her allies saw in her a leader unafraid to puncture the balloon of sanctimony. Her critics saw in her a threat to the comfortable order they had long relied upon. And both were right. She wasn't there to be polite. She was there to be heard. Even her fashion, her cadence, her refusal to sand down her edges became political statements. In a chamber obsessed with decorum, Crockett showed that authenticity was its own kind of power. When she spoke, millions of people who had never felt represented leaned closer to their screens. They saw themselves not in the rigid robes of authority, but in the sharp tongue and unyielding pride of a woman who knew the stakes. By the time Clarence Thomas accused her of disrespecting tradition, Crockett had already lived her life pushing against traditions that excluded, demeaned, and silenced. To her, tradition was not sacred just because it was old. It had to be earned. And if it failed to serve justice, it deserved to be challenged. That was the energy she carried into that chamber. She was not rattled by the weight of his title, nor seduced by the grandeur of the room. She carried with her the strength of every courtroom client dismissed by bias, every community sidelined by history, every family waiting for someone to speak truth to power. And so when she lifted her eyes toward Clarence Thomas, it wasn't just a stare. It was the unspoken promise of a fight he could not control. She had walked through too much, fought for too long, endured too many dismissals to be silenced now. Because Jasmine Crockett's story was not one of submission. It was one of defiance. And in that moment, she was ready to write its next. Chapter 1, that would show the entire nation what happens when the silenced refused to stay silent any longer. The chamber braced for her response. But before it came, the tension had to rise. The clash had to build. The accusation was just the spark. The real fire was still on its way. The words hung in the air like smoke, disrespecting tradition. Clarence Thomas had dropped his accusation, with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation was over, that the weight of history alone could silence any dissent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in calculation. The room felt it. That pause before impact, that stillness before a storm breaks. Reporters raised their pens, ready. C-SPANs. Cameras zoomed tighter. Members of Congress shifted in their seats, some nodding approvingly at Thomas's rebuke, others holding their breath, waiting for what they suspected might become the soundbite of the year. Thomas, emboldened by the silence, pressed forward. For generations, this chamber has stood as a beacon of order, he intoned, his voice steady, almost paternal. It is not for personal grandstanding. It is not for performance. It is for the continuity of this nation's values. When we allow individuals to disregard that, when we let disrespect become normalized, we weaken the very foundation of democracy itself. The words dripped with authority, and yet, beneath them, was something brittle. He invoked continuity, but his eyes flickered with unease. Because he knew Crockett wasn't about to let the statement rest. Her lips parted. But before she spoke, a ripple of sound coursed through the chamber, some murmurs of agreement, some scoffs of disbelief. Outside the chamber, Twitter was already alive with hashtags, #tradition, vs truth, #Crockett clapback. Screens across the nation replayed the clip on loop, the country waiting for her to fire back. She let him finish. That was her first move. Patience. Let him exhaust his sermon. Let him pile the weight of tradition higher and higher until it became too heavy to hold. And when the silence fell, she leaned forward, her tone calm but razor-sharp. Justice Thomas. She began with all due respect, tradition is not the same thing as truth. Tradition told women they couldn't vote. Tradition told black folks they had no place in this chamber at all. Tradition told immigrants to stay silent, to work, but never to lead. So forgive me if I don't bow to a tradition that never bowed. To people like me, the the words struck with precision, each syllable slicing through the air. Gasps erupted from one side of the chamber. On the other, a smattering of applause broke protocol before quickly being silenced by the gavel. Thomas's jaw tightened. His stare hardened, but Crockett wasn't done. "Respect," she continued, her voice rising just enough to command attention, without breaking into anger, "is not earned by hiding behind history. Respect is earned by serving people in the present, by protecting their futures, not by clinging to the past because it's comfortable for those in power." The chamber shifted again. This time, the murmurs grew louder, a tide rolling in. Thomas, usually the master of silence, was forced to speak. "Congresswoman, your words are inflammatory. They diminish the sacrifices of those who built this country," but Crockett cut in, not with rudeness, but with conviction. "No, Justice. My words honor their sacrifices. Because they didn't fight so their children could sit quietly and pretend everything was fine. They fought so their children could finally speak. And that's what I'm doing right now." Clash was no longer a simple exchange, it was a duel. It's one side wielding the authority of the past, the other wielding the urgency of the present. Every phrase sharpened the divide. Every rebuttal raised the stakes. And outside that chamber, the nation leaned closer. On phones and televisions, in dorm rooms and kitchens, the confrontation was playing out like a drama that couldn't be scripted. The villain and the hero locked in a battle over whose version of America would prevail. But Crockett wasn't finished. Her voice dropped lower, steadier, and somehow more powerful. "Tradition may comfort you, Justice Thomas, but for people like me, tradition has to often been the excuse for exclusion. And if that makes me disrespectful, then I will wear that label proudly." The final word echoed, and the silence that followed was thunderous. For a moment, even Thomas didn't respond. His authority had been challenged not with fury, but with undeniable truth. And the chamber knew this wasn't the end of the exchange. The real blow was still coming because Crockett hadn't yet delivered her sharpest weapon. She was saving that for the moment when the entire nation was watching, breath held, waiting for the strike that would send shockwaves far beyond those walls, the silence after. Jasmine Crockett's last words wasn't empty, it was charged. It was the silence of millions leaning in, of every heartbeat sinking to the anticipation of what she would say next. Clarence Thomas had thrown the weight of history at her, the mantle of tradition meant to bury her beneath its authority. But Crockett wasn't just standing, she was preparing to strike. Her eyes didn't waver. She leaned in just enough to make it clear she wasn't retreating, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a calm steadiness that made every syllable land with precision. "Justice Thomas," she began, "you talk about tradition as if it were sacred. What you call sacred, my community has often experienced as shackles. And I will not mistake the sound of chains for the sound of freedom." The words rippled through the chamber. Some lawmakers froze, stunned by the bluntness. Others shifted uncomfortably. Knowing instinctively that something bigger than a debate was unfolding, Thomas adjusted in his chair, his jaw clenching. He had weathered critics for decades, but this wasn't a law journal or a legal argument. This was raw, unapologetic truth spoken with the force of lived experience. And Crockett wasn't slowing down. "Tradition told my grandmother to enter. Through the back door," she said, her voice tightening. "Tradition told my parents that their labor mattered, but their voices didn't. Tradition told little girls who looked like me to dream smaller, speak softer, and never sit at this table. And now, in 2025, you're telling me that raising my voice is disrespecting tradition? No, Justice. What's disrespectful is pretending those traditions were ever just." Gasps broke out. A low murmur of approval spread through the gallery. Before the gavel slammed down for order, but it was too light, the momentum was hers. Crockett's cadence sharpened. She wasn't just speaking to Thomas anymore. She was speaking to America. "When you tell me to respect tradition, what I hear is a demand to respect exclusion. What I hear is a demand to respect silence. And with every fiber of my being, I refuse. Because tradition did not free us. Tradition did not feed us. Tradition did not save us. People did. Brave people who broke tradition, who disrespected the so-called order, so that we could even sit here today. For the first time in years, Thomas looked unsettled. His expression hardened, but his silence spoke volumes. He was being confronted not with legal theory, but with moral indictment. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on him, her tone quiet but unrelenting. You have built a career defending traditions that never defended us. You call it principle. You call it power protecting itself. Because the truth is, tradition has always been less about respect and more about control. The words cut like glass. In that moment, it was clear she wasn't just dismantling his argument, she was dismantling his legacy. Then came the line, the one that would play endlessly on cable news and ricochet across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. She paused, let the silence swell, and delivered it with perfect, deliberate force. If tradition means I'm supposed to bow my head and keep my mouth shut, then let history write it down plain. Jasmine Crockett disrespected tradition. Chamber erupted. Half the room burst into thunderous applause, while the other half hissed with outrage. The gavel slammed again, but the order was gone. Crockett had detonated her truth in the heart of the establishment, and there was no containing it. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't giving him the chance. She rode the wave of momentum, pressing the point harder. 'Cause let me be clear, my loyalty is not to tradition. My loyalty is to the people. To the single mother who works 2 jobs and still can't afford health care. To the young immigrant, a child who translates for her parents in classrooms that don't respect her brilliance. To the voter who stands in line for 5 hours because so-called tradition decided their community didn't deserve more polling places. Those are the people I answer to. Those are the voices I carry. They sent me here not to repeat the past, but to change it. Her words landed like a drumbeat, each example pulling the audience closer, each truth making the chamber feel smaller, or intimate like a courtroom where America itself was on trial. Thomas's face was stone, but the cracks were visible. He had spent decades swatting down critics, but this wasn't a critic. This was a confrontation. And the power dynamic had shifted. Crockett delivered. Her final strike with the gravity of someone who knew she was inscribing herself into the story of America. Justice Thomas, you call my words disrespectful, but I call them necessary. Because if respecting tradition means betraying the truth, then I will choose truth every single time. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Even those who opposed her sat motionless, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would not fade, and then applause. Slow at first, then swelling, echoing through the chamber as allies, supporters, and even some hesitant colleagues rose. To their feet, it wasn't unanimous. It wasn't polite. It was raw, divisive, electric, and it was exactly what she intended. Because this was never about one exchange. It was about a reckoning. A reminder that the authority of the past could be challenged and that sometimes the most powerful tradition of all is the courage to break one. As the applause thundered and the cameras captured every angle, the nation held its breath. On social media, the moment was already exploding. Hashtags multiplied, memes were born, and commentators scrambled to put words to what they had just witnessed, but none of them could quite capture the electricity in that room. None could package the shockwaves that were just beginning to ripple outward because Clarence Thomas had been the enforcer of the old order. But Jasmine Crockett had just shown America what happens when the new order refuses to stay silent, and the question now was clear. How far would those shockwaves spread? What came next would shake not just the chamber, but the country itself. The chamber was still buzzing. But outside those walls, the world was already on fire. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop, the moment was everywhere splashed. Across television screens replayed in endless loops on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. That single line, if tradition means I'm supposed to bow my head and keep my mouth shut, then let history write it down plain. Jasmine Crockett disrespected tradition was no longer just a rebuttal. It was a battle cry. The hashtags multiplied like sparks in dry grass. Hashtag disrespecting tradition. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag truth over tradition. Young activists posted clips over dramatic music, framing Crockett as the unshakable hero standing against an empire of silence. College students in crowded dorm rooms cheered as the video auto played, their voices rising in chants of her words. At rallies in cities from Atlanta to Los Angeles, speakers quoted her line as if it were scripture. Cable news anchors scrambled to keep up. On one side, conservative commentators fumed. They called her disorderly, unprofessional, a threat to the dignity of government. On the other, progressives celebrated her as the new face of resistance, fearless, articulate, unwilling to yield even before the most entrenched symbol of authority. Pundits clashed in primetime debates, their voices raised. But no one could deny the raw magnetism of the moment. And then came the celebrities. Musicians, actors, athletes all, posting the clip with captions of solidarity. "This is leadership," one rapper tweeted to millions of followers. A Hollywood actress wrote, "Tradition never fed us. Crockett speaks for every woman told to be quiet." Even NBA stars quoted her line before games, scrawling it on their sneakers in black marker. It wasn't just commentariat, it was a cultural eruption. Late-night comedians reenacted the exchange, mocking Thomas's stiff reliance on tradition and celebrating Crockett's fearless counterattack. Meme culture took over, Thomas depicted as a crumbling statue, Crockett as the lightning bolt cracking it open. Students plastered her words across protest signs, graffiti walls, viral TikTok edits, but it wasn't only her supporters who felt the tremors. On the other side, the backlash was immediate and ferocious. Conservative leaders accused her of grandstanding and undermining the sanctity of the chamber. Editorials and right-leaning outlets condemned her as dangerous and disrespectful. And yet Evan, in their fury, they couldn't stop talking about her. Every condemnation only amplified her reach. Meanwhile, ordinary people, migrants, workers, young voters, women who had been silenced in boardrooms and classrooms, flooded social media with personal stories. Tradition told me to stay silent. Tonight, Crockett gave me permission to speak. My parents came here with nothing. Tradition told them they didn't belong. Jasmine Crockett told me we do. Her words were no longer just hers. They'd become a mirror, reflecting the voices of millions who had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Even in international headlines, the story reverberated. Newspapers in Europe, Africa, and Asia ran features on the fiery exchange, framing it as a microcosm of America's battle between the old and the new. Commentators abroad noted the irony. A Supreme Court justice, himself once a symbol of progress, now scolding the next generation for challenging the very traditions that had once excluded him. The shockwaves weren't confined to rhetoric, they shook the ground of politics itself. Donations to Crockett's campaign surged in the hours after the clip went viral. Her office inbox overflowed with messages of support, volunteers pledging time, small-dollar donors sending what they could. At the same time, petitions circulated calling for investigations into Thomas's own traditions, his ethics, his connections, his history of controversy, and perhaps most telling of all, other lawmakers, long hesitant to confront figures of entrenched power, began to find their voices. Crockett's defiance gave them cover, made it clear that the old taboos of silence could be broken. In committee hearings, in interviews, in speeches, they began to push harder, to question louder. It was as if her stand had unlocked a door. Others had been too afraid to touch, but through all the applause, all the backlash, all the media frenzy, one question lingered. What would come of it? Would this be remembered as a fleeting viral moment? Another spark swallowed by the endless cycle of outrage? Or would it mark a turning point? A line in the sand that showed America what happens when the guardians of tradition are finally challenged? Not with whispers, but with a roar. Because as Clarence Thomas sat in silence, watching the storm he could not control, and as Jasmine Crockett stood taller, fueled not by tradition but by truth, the country was left on edge. The ripple had become a wave, and the wave was gathering. Strength. But what lesson would it leave behind? And who in the end would claim victory, the guardians of tradition, or those daring enough to break it? As the dust settled, it became clear what had unfolded was no mere exchange of words, it was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's defiance was more than a clash with Clarence Thomas. It was a confrontation with the very idea that traditions simply, by existing, deserved reverence. And in the days that followed, Americans wrestled with a deeper question. What is worth preserving, and what must finally be left behind? For generations, tradition had been treated like stone, unyielding and immovable. But Crockett's counterattack reminded people that stone can be cracked, that the monuments of the past are not untouchable if they rest on foundations of exclusion. Her words became a challenge to anyone who would ever bow their head against their will, anyone who had been told that respect meant silence. And in that challenge, there was something larger than outrage. There was inspiration. Teachers played the clip in classrooms, not just as a lesson in politics, but as a lesson in courage. Parents showed their children, saying, "Look, this is what it means to stand up, even when they tell you to sit down." Churches and community groups wove her words into sermons, framing them as echoes of past struggles where justice demanded. Breaking tradition, the moral clarity of her stance cut through the noise. She had not dismissed history, she had reframed it. She reminded America that the true heroes of its story were not the ones who upheld the status quo, but the ones who defied it. The abolitionists who broke laws to free the enslaved, the suffragettes who marched despite jeers and beatings, the civil rights leaders who faced down fire hoses and jail cells. None of them were respecting tradition. They were rewriting. It is and now Jasmine Crockett stood in that lineage, not perfect, not sainted, but real flawed, fiery, and unafraid. She embodied the lesson that dignity is not inherited from marble statues or solemn rules of order. Dignity is earned in the act of refusing to bow when truth demands you stand. Clarence Thomas had tried to wield tradition as a weapon, a final word meant to silence dissent. But Crockett had transformed it into a mirror, exposing that tradition. Without justice is not heritage, it is hypocrisy. And that truth resonated not just with the young or the marginalized, but with anyone who had ever questioned whether America could still live up to its promise. The resolution was not neat. The chamber remained divided, the nation still polarized, but within the tension was something vital: hope. Hope that new voices could pierce the silence. Hope that disrespecting unjust traditions was not a betrayal of America, but its salvation. And perhaps that was the ultimate moral of the moment, that patriotism is not blind obedience. Patriotism is love strong enough to demand better. To say we can be more than what we were told to accept, to insist that the future is not chained to the past. As Crockett herself reflected in interviews days later, tradition never built this country. Courage did. And courage is what we need now. Her words echoed not just as political rhetoric, but as an invitation. An invitation for ordinary people to see themselves as part of the story, not spectators to tradition, but authors of what comes next. And so the confrontation closed not with bitterness, but with a spark. A spark that told millions watching that they, too, had the right to speak. It's the right to challenge, the right to disrespect any tradition that denied their humanity. Because in the end, the real tradition worth honoring is not silence. It is struggle. Not obedience, but freedom. And Jasmine Crockett's stand was a reminder that the fight for that freedom is far from finished. The room may have quieted, but the movement was only beginning. And what came after would depend on what America chose to carry forward, the weight of the past, the possibility of tomorrow. The moment began with a single accusation, disrespecting tradition. But what it became was something far greater. A spark that forced a nation to choose between silence and truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer Clarence Thomas. She answered every voice that ever tried to shrink her, to shrink us. Beneath the weight of history, her words were not a rejection of America. They were a demand that America live up to its highest calling. Because respect without justice is empty. Tradition without progress is hollow. And dignity, real dignity, comes not from bowing to the past, but from building a future that includes us all. This is the lesson we take forward: the courage to speak, even when silence is expected, the strength to challenge authority, even when it feels untouchable, and the wisdom to know that our voices, our stories, and our truths are not disruptions to tradition. They are the evolution of it. So to those watching, the choice is yours. Will you bow your head, or will you raise your voice? Will you cling to traditions that excluded us, or will you write new ones that honor us? Jasmine Crockett showed what it means to choose truth over fear, progress over stagnation, dignity over deference. Now it's our turn. If this story moved you, if you believe in a future where justice is stronger than tradition, then don't just watch, be part of it. Share this story. Add your voice. Build the movement. Because history is not written by those who stayed quiet, it is written by those who dared to speak. And tonight, let it be clear, the mic belongs to us.